Okay, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Liz, and I'm going to be chairing the fourth session of the oral presentations. We have 4 fantastic presentations to share with you, and then we'll open the floor for questions in between each. So without further ado, I'll announce our first speaker, who is Oisin Challen Flynn, who's an MPhil student in world history and will be telling us about his research on Imidir sit-in, resource extraction, and environmental protests in North Africa. Thank you.
Hello everyone, thank you. So today I'm going to be taking you away from the rain to a very arid, dry region of southeastern Morocco, where water struggles and struggles over water have been very important. I'm going to be focusing on Imidir, which is a village that waged a very long campaign about pollution coming from a silver mine, which started off as a very small, very localized dispute, but when they staged a sit-in occupation in 2011 that ran through to 2019, on top of a mountain at part of the mine, they gained national and international news attention and generated a national debate about sustainable resource extraction in Morocco. This is where we are to help you out. Why did I choose to focus on this movement? Other than the fact that it's a very interesting, quite inspiring actually movement, I think that the study of Imidir can be used to explore some wider themes, such as what leads to the outbreak of these sorts of environmental protest movements, which are becoming more and more common across the region, especially those related to water. It also fits into newer interdisciplinary academic discussions about sustainability, extractivism, and the interaction of social movements more generally. Within this developing literature, there's also been relatively little written about North Africa compared to places like Latin America or North America. So this study aims to expand some of this gap, not just in content, but also actually looking at some of the concepts that have been used to develop, seeing if these are like sort of location specific or if they can be used to look at different contexts as well. Just a very brief notice on method as well. This is actually research that I did as an undergraduate doing history. I'd intended to travel to this village and speak to people and immerse myself. It was during COVID, obviously the sort of standard intro. So I had to do a lot of stuff switching on to online. Luckily, it was a very prolific movement that spread stuff online pretty much every day of their existence. So I had a whole host of sort of poetry, films, speeches, posts to draw on. And I managed to speak to some people online as well, which was fantastic. So some background to the movement. We start with 2 parallel histories, the history of the village and the history of the mine. Imidir is an Amazigh-speaking village in southeast Morocco, in a very arid region, as I've mentioned. The population is and has been for a very long time mostly semi-nomadic, so they spend part of the year raising animals, part of the year as settled farmers, where they grow wheat, dates, and almonds. Villagers say that this style of living has been practiced for thousands of years and is enabled by a complex set of irrigation systems called khetra that have been existed since the Roman times. Our point of interest begins when a silver mine was established in this region, the impacts of which would destabilize this well-balanced economic and ecosystem. The first silver mine in Imidir was opened in the French colonial period, shortly before independence. After independence, it was inherited by a subsidiary company owned by the Moroccan royal family, which is called Managem. Managem is now a massive firm that invests in mining operations across Africa, including in Niger, the Ivory Coast, and Sudan. The first tensions with the local community began as mining operations began to impact on their lifestyles in a number of ways. Most of these were related to water, as you might imagine, in a very dry region. The mine used chemical treatment processes to purify the silver, spilloffs of which ran over into local water supplies, poisoning villagers. It also began to divert more and more water from irrigation systems, leaving less for farming. And mining operations also damaged farmland or even confiscated it from locals. There was finally also an issue of economic inequality. The mine was extracting millions of pounds from silver, which meant most of it went straight to the Moroccan royal family. Villages in Imidir were amongst the poorest and most illiterate in Morocco. So that although initially some locals found employment in the mine, even these jobs soon became scarce as they were replaced by people from other regions, partly because of problems of expertise, but also because the mine owners began to fear the growing militancy of the local movement and feared a connection between local villages and the trade union movement within the mine. Cumulatively, these changes meant that life became unsustainable for many people. Some people opted to emigrate and leave for the city, in a sense becoming climate refugees. Others remained and became increasingly militant. As miners ignored, for the most part, local people's demands, this militancy built and emerged into successive waves of protests in 1986, in 1996, in 2004 and 2011. I spoke to people from the village. I managed to contact them online. They were able to send me some of the photos and records that they have of the previous rounds of protests. These were, for the most part, met with very heavy repression as well. This is a man named Lahsan Uzbeden, and he was the first martyr of the movement. So he was brutally arrested by police, he was tortured in prison, and then he died upon release from his prison wounds. So from 1996, the movement had a bit more of a different political flavor as well, as they now had a martyr for their movement as well. And it kind of tied into broader questions of state repression within Morocco. This was pretty much the case up until 2011. Now, 2011 was the most recent wave of protests, and this had quite a bit different character. Evidently, by 2011, there'd been a background of mobilization, and anger had been building for many years. In 2011, in the context of building radicalism and protests across Morocco and the region, kind of in the backdrop of the very early stages of the Arab Spring, students returning home from university launched the biggest wave of protests yet. Accompanied by the rest of the village, they marched to the top of the mountain where a pump was supplying water to the mine, forcibly shut down the pump and established a protest camp. They didn't know at this point, but they were going to hold this camp for 8 years, capture national and international media attention, and even have a full-length film produced about them, which you can see here. I'm short on time, but part of my study focused on the mobilization tactics that enabled them to do this and hold out for so long and capture such international attention. I will summarize very briefly, but the key was full involvement of the local community, effective solidarity with other similar movements, and gaining media attention. The sit-in camp became a focus of village life, with democratic forums held every week to decide on the actions to take as part of the movement. This adapted a local tradition called agrawi, which, according to people that I spoke to, stemmed back hundreds of years. They used music, theatre. This is a play talking about the effects of the mine on villages, and all sorts of other media forms to attract people to the camp. Each year they held a festival that attracted international visitors. And there was a key role played by Nadir Bouhmouch, who is a filmmaker from Marrakesh who came to stay in the camp and help to publicize their movement. They were also very successful at capturing media attention, choosing key moments to protest, such as COP22, which was held in Marrakesh. COP22, one of the main sponsors was Managem, who was the company that was responsible for owning the mine. So you can imagine the sorts of messaging that the villagers were putting out in response to this. Some of them are here, actually. Memes are very important to some of these movements. This is one showing one of the owners, the operators of the mine, with a background to some of the spill-offs from the mine, saying arsenic is good for the skin. This is also a picture of the protest that they staged outside COP22. As you can see, this was part of a process actually by which they started to make connections with some other movements more internationally, which I'm going to talk about now. Because actually one of the things that I found most interesting about this movement was these connections that they began to make with other movements, partly because of what it showed us about the development of this movement itself. The movement was very clearly embedded within the Amazigh cultural movement, which is a struggle that existed for many years in Morocco for the rights of the Tamazight-speaking minority. But their politics clearly went much deeper than this and was very clearly orientated around resource management and the idea that local people were better equipped to manage resources sustainably. This pushed them to identify with movements that actually went much beyond the scope of the traditional Amazigh movement. They participated in an international solidarity campaign that toured sites in North Africa of environmental protest, Gafsa in Tunisia, for example, where villagers were living with poisoning from phosphate mining, movements against fracking in Algeria. There's a very interesting set of documentaries made by Nadir Bouhmouch himself and Hamza Hamouchen, who's an Algerian activist scholar, I've got 1 minute, that's good, called Paradises on Earth. It's very worth checking out. Internationally, they also began to identify with movements like the North Dakota Access Pipeline, which was protests on indigenous territory in the US. This brings me then to my main argument, which is that I argued that the direction of politics within this movement and the networks that they were forming represented a resource turn within previous existing movements. Sometimes these movements talked about indigeneity, sometimes they talked about marginalization of specific regions, others stemmed from workers or labor movements. But all of these shared a focus on resource sovereignty and local people being the better guardians of natural resources than large corporations. As with every good investigation, there were more questions raised for me than I answered. I've put up some of these on the board. That's my own timer, thank you. I've put up some of these on the board that people can have a look at. I've got no time left, so I'm just going to highlight the very last one, because I think it's one of the most interesting ones, which is actually the connections to some of the wider processes in the region. And in a region that's seen mass political participation in some quite new ways in the last 15 years, in the form of the 2011 or 2019 revolutions. What were the role of environmental protests in shaping these? We already know that questions over drought, pollution, phosphate mining in Tunisia or fracking in Algeria, and also the question of emigration and climate refugees have played a major role in the background of political organizing in this part of the world. But they're still very underexplored in academia. So what I want to ask is actually that in furthering some of these questions, what can we learn about some of these new models of participation that people in this part of the world have produced, political, environmental action that involve mass participation and those normally on the margins of political decision making. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. We have time for a couple of questions, if anyone has any.
So what's happening there now? I mean, did the protest stop in 2019? You kind of led us up to that moment, and then I'm on a cliffhanger. I need to know what happened next.
So unfortunately, after 2019, they took a vote in their camp to dismantle the camp. I've followed their social media since. They said that they were going to shift to different forms of political action. I haven't necessarily seen much of that since. I think probably it was a case of actually they lost momentum. So it's not necessarily a success story. They were very successful in generating a sort of key moment and maybe a cultural shift and maybe a discussion. They ultimately were kind of outsourced by the mine. Actually, the pump that they were shutting off, the mine eventually, after a few years, opened up a different pump somewhere else and started diverting water from another nearby village. So it was a kind of strategic question where they decided this wasn't working anymore. I think a lot of the stuff that they've still carried on doing is, for example, the film that they produced. They've done a lot of stuff internationally, and I still see lots of film screenings with different groups across Europe, across North Africa, that they're promoting with this. But yeah, I'm not sure. I think some of it as well is the difficulties of researching a movement in a climate where people are quite scared to talk about things because of political pressure. So I don't know exactly what they're doing right now.
Anna, fascinating work. Great, congratulations. Very interesting. I mean, there's so much in this that's interesting. First, your comparison with the Americas, right, where the indigenous groups have been very vocal over the last 30, 40 years. But my first question is about health, obviously. So how much is health present in this narrative, and are they actually talking about health, or it's mostly environment? Then my second comment is about intergenerational kind of protest, and you can see children on these photos, and I think that's also quite interesting. So what came up that you could consider intergenerational forms of protest across so many years, and obviously through their children and generations to come? Yeah.
Thank you. So for the first one, health was a really big part of it. I didn't mention it, but one of the kind of key slogans of their movement was this phrase aman iman, which in Amazigh means water is life. Because it's such an arid region, that's always been a very key political thing for hundreds of years. One of the main claims that they were making, and they sort of brought in different scientists and that sort of thing to back up, was the effects of the poisoning from the mine system on people's health, especially on women's health, because they tended to be closer to water, cooking, using water more often. So that was a big part of it. One of the problems with my oral history was that I only speak French, I don't speak Amazigh, so the people that I tended to speak to were men, because of the sort of education inequalities. Most of the women didn't speak French, they spoke Amazigh, and just Amazigh, and no Arabic either. So that was an interesting part of it, but that was a very big part of their demands on the company. Sorry, what was the second part of the question? It was... Yeah, that came up quite a lot. Actually, a big part in each wave was student protests. So a lot of the people from the village, because of lack of economic opportunities, they'll go and study somewhere else and then come back for the summer holidays. So in 1996 and then in 2011, both times, it was students who came back from studying away who kind of had the memories from older generations, but were kind of a little bit willing to try something different, or had been to university at a time, for example, in Morocco, where they had the beginnings of the Hirak movement and were sort of like, had some new ideas or whatever it was. In 1996, the specific spark was students who'd come back used to seasonal work in the summer, and the mine said, no, we're not going to employ you this summer. So then they said, well, we're going to protest. I don't know if that directly answers it, but I think there was quite clear signs of sort of a learning from older generations, but each time they were like, okay, this didn't work, so what can we do? There was a definite escalation each time. So 2011, they saw it as a major escalation. Yeah, I don't know if that gets directly to it, but... Oh, actually, there was student strikes, though, from the schools, which was really interesting to see. So actually, they had a whole year where the students didn't go to schools, which was quite a big deal because it was very hard to access the schools, like very young students. But yeah.
Thank you so much, Oshin.
Thank you.
Okay, so next up we have Sarah Corona, who is an MPhil student in Heritage Studies and will be telling us about her research on Sardinian heritage and ethnic identity under Italian green resource nationalism. So please join me in welcoming her.
Wow, Sheen is very tall. So, just a second, I need to check how to go further. Was it like this? Yes, okay. So, first of all, before starting this presentation, it is about the social politics of heritage in Sardinia. And before explaining what Sardinia is, because I don't know if all of you know it, it's important to say that I am Sardinian, born and raised there. So basically, mine is a look from the inside to my own culture. And the research I will now present is the research I'm conducting in my MPhil thesis in heritage studies at the Department of Archaeology. So this, of course, means that the research is still ongoing. And even in specific, the mobilizations I will talk about are happening right now. So please bear in mind that what I will now present are all preliminary conclusions. So a bit of background. The context of this research is nationalism and nation building and ethnic conflicts within nation states, in particular when they result in claims for separation or autonomy from the state. And my focus is the role of culture in this framework. So I will draw both on studies of nationalism and the literature in the field of heritage studies. And the reason why I believe in an interdisciplinary approach is because culture and nationalism are strongly intertwined. And several studies show that culture is like among the fields in which states play out their macro policies for managing ethnic tensions, and in particular, in strategies such as integration, assimilation, annexations are used to various degrees as strategies to resolve conflict through the targeting of ethnic differences as cultural specificities. So my case study is the Mediterranean island of Sardinia, which is a region of Italy. Why Sardinia? Sardinia is a particularly interesting case study, in my opinion, both for nationalism or nation building and for the maintenance of ethnic identities. Usually studies on ethnic conflict tend to focus on places where the conflict is apparent or highly politicized. So these studies also tend to intensify alongside public interest, for example, as a result of media coverage when there are institutional claims or when the conflict erupts in protests. In Western Europe, this was the case of Catalonia, Scotland, Ireland, Corsica, and the Basque Country in recent years. I'm sure you've heard more or less of all of them. Sardinia instead is less studied, especially outside of Sardinia, and especially in Italy, because its separatism is less conflictive, less politicized, and it's also less present in the public discourse. Sardinia is a place, let's say, where one might say that nationalism, Italian nationalism, of course, has been successful to a certain extent. Sardinian language is not taught in schools. Separatist parties obtain minimum electoral percentages. The Sardinian region is, to all intents and purposes, an organ of the state. And furthermore, in Sardinian public discourse, Italian nationality is implied as a fact. So Sardinia is usually referred to as a place in Italy, and Sardinian things and places are considered Italian. This especially happens in the media. Yet, there is a conflict. Political scientist Carlo Pala calls it an ethno-territorial cleavage that is like under the surface and reemerges periodically. And Italian nationalism, in specific Italian nationalist discourse in the island, has been clashing with a strong ethnic identity, which was historically politicized as and alongside class struggles in the island. So as a result, Sardinians experience a polymorph identity phenomenon. So they are split between those who embrace Sardinian identity as coexistent or even incorporated into Italianness, and those who experience Sardinianness as opposed to Italianness. And furthermore, which I think is particularly interesting, Sardinians consider themselves as a people. So it is very common, even for those that feel Italians, to claim that before that, they first and foremost feel Sardinians. So we have a persistence of the ethnic identity in Sardinia. And I argue that the reason why Italian nationalism has been until now successful, at least in preventing this ethnic identity from turning into strong, widespread separatist claims, is because it has exerted nation building mostly through the uses of culture. That is, it basically has consistently preferred covert policies of cultural homogenizations over overtly violent or coercive nation building strategies. Historically, in fact, making the Italians in Sardinia has meant eradicating Sardinian ethnic identity through cultural policies, of which like the indirect repression of Sardinian language through literacy exclusively in Italian is, I think, the most emblematic and continues to the present day. We're not allowed to speak Sardinian in schools. Recently, though, Italian nation building seems to have reached a point where it is less about erasing Sardinian identity, and it's more about absorbing it into Italianness. So it's not anymore you are Italians because, you're not, basically now they're not saying anymore you are Italians, not Sardinians. Now they are saying you are Italians because you are Sardinians, which is quite different. While the other one, you are Italians, not Sardinian, was basically the policy during fascism. And as a clear example of this, I've put a picture here. This is a fake nuraghe, which is a Sardinian Bronze Age building, and it's fake. It was built in 2008, I think, in northern Italy, so not in Sardinia. And it's wrapped in the Italian flag, you can see it, to celebrate a national ceremony. And this conflict between Sardinian and Italian identity is especially mobilized, in my opinion, in the public discourse around issues that are key to identity. And cultural heritage appears to be the most powerful of such mobilizers. I've put here some examples of Sardinian cultural heritage. I would just describe the one at the top, that I think is particularly interesting. It's a writing on a wall that you see here. It says in Sardinian language, Limba, Historia, Cultura, pros estudiantes sardos o Escola Sarda. It means language, history, culture for Sardinian students, and it asks for a Sardinian school, for a school where you learn in Sardinian. And this one is the symbol of the 4 Moors, which is the Sardinian flag. A pilot study that I did to track down the heritage discourse and its relationship with identity in the media showed a mobilization of identity discourses around situations of conflict mostly. And one issue in particular appeared to ignite strong identity claims in reaction to this perceived threat from the outside. And it was the increased number of wind farm projects carried out by Italian and foreign corporations in the island. And right now there is grassroots opposition in the rural areas that are targeted by these projects, and it is ongoing. The concern they have, these people have in particular, over the impact of the wind turbine is a concern of the impact on the landscape, which is not merely aesthetical, it's a concern towards the alteration of the cultural landscape. So, cultural landscape that is central to identity. Actually, this opposition is something that has been seen elsewhere in and outside of Europe around wind turbines and other big renewable energy projects. But I think Sardinia is unique in how this relates to nationalism and the ethnic conflict. From the point of view of Italian nationalism, wind farm projects in Sardinia fit into an historical pattern of exploiting local resources as national resources. And this is what Daniele Conversi, which is a researcher in the field of nationalism, calls resource nationalism, which in this case is declined as green resource nationalism, still resource nationalism though. From the bottom-up point of view, there is an historical sense of marginality where the state is seen as altering Sardinian territory in the process of exploiting the resources. And not only do locals perceive the wind turbines as another strategy from the national state to dispossess them of their resources, but there is also this strong sense of epistemic injustice in deciding over the use of the land and also in accessing the knowledge of the past that is perceived as if it was retained in the landscape. What I argue here is that this concern is strongly rooted in a perception of Sardinianness as other than Italian, that is in the ethnic identity. As you can see here, Sardinian rural landscape is dotted with thousands of archaeological sites belonging to the local Bronze Age Nuragic civilization. In the last decades, this civilization became the historical reference par excellence for Sardinian ethnic identity. This means that the landscape has a strong meaning and is valued for being both natural and antique. And basically for this integration between the natural environment and local people, it might appear as a contradiction, but it's actually not. And the landscape is basically a witness of this historical harmony between people and land. And in bearing the memory of a past that is shared among all Sardinians, therefore the landscape is what I call a repository of the ethno-national history. And this is another cultural reason for the strong reactions against wind turbines. My research question that I will try and answer with ethnographic fieldwork in some of the rural villages targeted by these projects is then, what is the role of heritage in the present conflict between Sardinian and Italian identity as re-emerging around the disputes over the wind farms? And I particularly want to know if and to what extent people believe that the state is trying to eradicate Sardinian identity through the active destruction of memory. As a conclusion, why is this topic relevant? So I think it's very relevant because the academic community consistently fails to acknowledge cultural homogenization within nation states when it is covert. There is a fear that meeting the demands of separatist movements might result in political instability. To the extent that basically when ethnic identities are studied, or as they're called nativist, which is kind of a derogatory term, they are studied with the aim of counteracting them for the sake of international peace. But we must be aware that peace within nation states means this. And this forced homogenization is not only a problem for the cultural and ethnic minorities that historically exist within any national territory, but for the whole of humanity. We talked about, Anoa talked about it yesterday, how crucial is the knowledge of indigenous communities for the challenges we face in the present world. This also means the knowledge of other land-based people as well, even when they are not described as indigenous. That is, it's a knowledge that is lost under these pressures. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Do we have any questions?
It's interesting that the language was lost, because you think in Wales they kept the language even though there was a land border. When was the language lost?
It's not actually lost, meaning that it's still spoken, but there's an imbalance between geographically. There are some areas, especially the ones that are inside Sardinia, like highland areas that are more far away of the coast where the tourists arrive, and there the language is spoken more, and even children speak it. But like where I come from, and especially from the tourist areas, it's not transmitted inside the families. So the problem of speaking it in school is one problem, and then we also have the problem of a transmission within the family, because basically people that are now the age of my dad, of my mom, but even my grandparents, they were taught that speaking Sardinian was something for uneducated people. So they thought it was best not to teach it to their children. And basically now, most of us, like many of us people, young people, we want to learn Sardinian, and we find ourselves clashing with our parents all the time, trying to ask them, can you please speak Sardinian to me? And they are unable to do that with how much they have internalized this bias towards their own language, basically. My dad is forgetting the language. He keeps mixing it with Italian all the time and doesn't even recognize it.
Thank you.
Something that I was fascinated by that was only a small part of your presentation was the history with the fascism and how that was a different form of homogenization. And I was wondering if you see today's rather peaceful sort of nationalism and cultural homogenization as a result of the more violent homogenization of the past. And if you could maybe just speak a little bit more on the history there.
So about the history, there's not many studies on the topic, which is interesting. But definitely during fascism, there was a policy of building the Italian. But it is something that comes back to when Italy was built in the first place. There is a politician that is called Massimo d'Azeglio that is quite much quoted on the issue, because he said, now we've made Italy, now we must make the Italians. And this meant, of course, culturally homogenizing the national territory within in order to build the Italian citizen. And during fascism, I think it was particularly clear because, of course, it was using also violence, or at least the threat of violence, to force people into abandoning that identity. And this also meant, for example, forbidding people to name their children with Sardinian names, speaking Sardinian. It was kind of very much targeted. I think now the situation is definitely changed, but it's more tricky because it's still forbidden in a way. It's, of course, no one is going to, how can I say, target you and put you into prison if you talk Sardinian, but still there has been, for decades, demands towards the national government to incorporate Sardinian in schools, and the national government just doesn't allow that. And there's also several studies on the reason why they do it. And especially in the 60s in Sardinia, there was this whole moment where the Italian state was trying to not only homogenize culturally Sardinia, but also to make the Italian citizen as citizens that could be, they could merge into a specific idea of the citizen as non-threatening towards the state. So in Sardinia, there's one of the main economic activity for a long time has been herding. And herding is an activity that isolates people the way that is conducted in Sardinia. And so society is built around that. We have isolated herders that go in the countryside, they stay there for months and then come back to the family. And this specific way of structuring society was seen as a threat from the state. And so the eradication of the language through literacy in Italian was part of this policy of trying to make Sardinians Italian, but even make them not threatening to the structure of the state. I don't know if I explained that properly. And it's trickier, though, because now it only uses culture, and it's difficult to pinpoint it, I think.
I think that's all the time that we have for questions at the moment, but thank you so much, Sarah. Okay, next we have Nancy Karaman, who's in her final year of her PhD at the MRC Epidemiology Unit. Today, she'll be sharing her research on the state role in dietary public health policymaking. So please help me welcome her to the stage.
Thank you. So I'm afraid this might sound rather dry compared to the two awesome presentations we just listened to. Also, if you didn't know that I was Research Council funded, now you do. I'm required to brand my presentations. All right, so without further ado, as Liz mentioned, my name's Nancy, and I'm a third-year PhD student at Wolfson, and I'm going to be presenting on a review that I've conducted over the first well, it's supposed to be first year of my PhD. It ended up being 2 years of my PhD, on the sort of proper role of the state in making dietary or food policy as debated in academic discourse specifically. So I've got a couple kind of alarming images here. One is a quote from Jacob Rees-Mogg, and the other is an image of a nanny holding an infant. So these two are referring to kind of like the entryway that I got into this topic through, which is the phrase the nanny state. It's a very UK-specific phrase. Where I'm from in the US, you don't hear it very much, but I think it gets pretty incisively into kind of the core of this debate about paternalism and state paternalism in particular. So this is often a pejorative term that's used to frame a particular objection to the way that the state might intervene into both public and private life, but usually private life. And it contests that the government isn't allowing people to live their lives the way they want to. So this is both insulting in that it intervenes with individual choice and freedom at the core heart of it, as well as substituting the judgment of the state for those of the individual concerned. So this is especially interesting to me in the arena of food, where debates over things like sugar taxes, advertising restrictions, and where things can be even placed in supermarkets often invoke this kind of retaliatory pejorative term. So as you can see in the article, Jacob Rees-Mogg is demanding freedom for chocolate oranges because of a nanny state rule that doesn't allow you to display those products at the end of supermarket stalls. So I think food is kind of inherently political because we all do it, we all eat, we all ingest these projects. So I decided to make this part of the first project of my PhD, and to see if it is generally considered permissible by academics to intervene in people's food practices. And so that's what I did. I did a review on this subject. My specific method here is called a scoping review. I called it a critical scoping review because I did it a little bit differently than people normally do it. But in brief, my research question is listed up here, and I'll just translate it to, I think, more intelligible speak, which is basically, how do academics describe the role of the state in making this kind of policy? So this is policy that affects, is or perceived to affect individual choice around food and diet across the world. That was the intention. So I ended up searching a large number of databases with the help of a very, very competent medical librarian, who I owe a lot of thanks to, and got over 4,000 titles and abstracts. I then reviewed these down to a nice number of 35 texts that were from fields as disparate as economics, medicine, as you'd expect, but also law, policy studies, and social sciences, so sociology included. I then did this thing called inductive thematic coding, which basically just means I read texts and I identified patterns across those texts, and then created themes with my own sort of perspective and critical analysis, and then presented them as part of a paper, which is not quite published yet. So I'm just going to use a selection of quotes to kind of illustrate the kinds of themes that I identified and created through my analysis of these texts here, and kind of give you a window into what I read. So first of all, get my notes. I'm not going to read you this quote, but I'm going to leave it up there for you to look at while I talk. So one of the primary problems that I identified in academic discourse was the problem of choice. And it represents, I think, a particular primacy of personal liberty in Western societies and Western liberal democracies specifically. And no surprise, that's actually where the majority of my authors were located and studying. This requires that government intervention is rigorously justified because choice is protected kind of above all other values in this framework. But arguably, there are choices that may not be fully autonomous, and that's what this quote is getting at to here. Nancy Cass and co-authors are basically challenging the idea that we have a kind of pure freedom of choice in the arena of diet and food choice specifically. Other philosophers will also just challenge the whole concept of choice, but this is a sort of a medium tone version here. And basically, this means that if you're arguing that choice is free, then maybe you might not think that government intervention is warranted because people are making decisions for themselves. Isn't that the whole point? Whereas some authors, like Cass et al. Here, would disagree with that. They would say, actually, there's a lot of other things that influence us, like advertising or the fact that we can't buy food most of the time, apart from multinational corporations that have different sort of structures and incentives. Very related to the problem of choice is the problem of responsibility, and responsibility for health decisions and health outcomes. So if we operate under this freedom of choice model that I just described, it may logically follow that people then choose bad health outcomes. I disagree with this, but some people don't. So I think what we're operating with here, it means that whether we have an obligation to intervene and to help improve health outcomes kind of depends on how we attribute responsibility for those decisions and the resulting consequences of decisions. So I kind of outlined a few of the problems I think I have with the choice model. I think they kind of apply to a personal responsibility model as well. Is that if we are not able to make decisions in the way that we'd like to, or maybe we were having different influences over our environment that make that impossible, should we be held as solely responsible for the ways that our lives play out? And I think this is the part where the kind of the welfare state argument comes in as well. And yeah, I just would say that there's probably other ways of conceptualizing our obligations towards people, like human rights, for example, or solidarity approaches that are not usually captured by this perspective. Second to last one here is about proportionality. So this is a little bit less, I think, obvious than the first two I have brought up, but this talks about how the size and scope of intervention must be tailored specifically to the scope of the problem, which seems pretty obviously logical, I would say. But the thing is, this almost always happens through a form of logic that I term as economic logic, which is cost-benefit analysis or related forms of analysis. And that's often used to determine sort of the cutoff line or acceptable balance for public health interventions, as well as other types of policy problems. It's not limited to public health, but I think it is sometimes particularly problematic in public health because it makes public health a strictly economic issue in a lot of these debates and discussions. So I would say, are there other ways, and some authors that I'm obviously not framing here because Grumman think that cost-benefit analysis is the way to go. Are there other ways that we should be thinking about this? Are there other considerations that maybe are not adequately captured by a financialized, economized model like cost-benefit analysis? And lastly, I'll just talk briefly about legitimacy and its role in democratic and liberal democracy, and legitimacy specifically, where power is conceived to derive from the consent of the people. And specific democratic procedures like voting codify government legitimacy in action. So this was used as a discursive form by authors to both affirm and to challenge specific policy interventions. So in this case, we're talking about a ban on trans fats in California. And Resnick here is arguing that this ban would have failed if it was put to a vote, which is kind of discursively suggesting that it is illegitimate because people wouldn't have voted for it. We live in a democracy. We can only do things that people vote for. So this is another way that that policies were either affirmed or contested. All right, I want to kind of tie this all together because I know it's been a little disparate. I think it's important for me to first note that the vast majority of my papers were actually, the papers that I looked at were actually published by academics in the global north / west, depending on which philosophy you adhere to. And that this debate about liberty and freedom is inherently historicized and politicized one and mostly centered in Western democracies. So it's kind of unsurprising that these things were what I turned up in some ways. There's three major things that I want to draw out here though. So first, narratives that attribute responsibility for health outcomes to individuals rather than other possible entities like corporations, governments, or even environments not only depict an unrealistic understanding of human agency, they also can perpetuate harm and inequity directly. So things like stigma, for example. Secondly, we don't seem to have a very nuanced discussion about choice and freedom going on. One interesting dimension of this conversation that is generally lacking is how important choices are to individuals, either objectively or subjectively, and even to question the framing of choices altogether. So we tend to assume that choice in academic discussion is the most important thing and treat this as kind of a monolith. But surely there are more and less important choices in my life that I can make, like whether my children can go to a good school versus whether I can buy a soda pop. But these tend to be really reduced in the scale of academic discourse. Lastly, this conversation doesn't really involve much consideration of the deep involvement of industry and corporate actors in food and public health. So as I said before, the vast majority of food in our daily lives is produced, manufactured, and distributed, as well as sometimes retailed, by large multinational corporations. And this just is shockingly under-discussed in academic discourse. Given the predominance of academic language and logics, including cost-benefit analysis in this, it seems like this is a rather enormous blind spot, to me at least. Very lastly, I'm just going to say why this all matters, because I think all research should do this. In this case, I'd argue that taking a critical look about how academics think and discuss these topics is really important, especially in public health, because of the close linkages between academia, government, and the public, and media as well. So the figure to the right of my slide is actually taken from a government white paper on health published in 2010 called Healthy People, Healthy Lives. And as you can see, choice is central here. So this is sort of establishing what kind of intervention is permissible. And it starts with don't intervene, and it goes up to completely eliminate choice. You'll see there's no other values that are listed here. There's no other considerations. It's just about liberty, which, while it was actually published in a sort of wider discussion by academics from the Nuffield Council on Bioethics in 2007, that was completely lifted into government policy without any of that contextual information being there. So I think this has been misapplied to make choice the literal only thing besides financial cost that government has to think about when doing these sort of analyses of whether they should intervene in specific policy mechanisms. And I think this is an important problem that sometimes we encounter as researchers. So I'll just leave it there. I know I'm out of time, but thank you so much. Just acknowledgements.
Thank you, Nancy. Do we have questions?
Thank you. It was a great talk. I just want to ask for your personal opinion on what is a good policy in terms of what we eat and what we drink. Do you think a good policy should reflect our desire or it should guide our desire?
This is a really good question. So I'll start by saying that I am not a behavioral psychologist, so I don't have a whole lot of insight into preferences. I'm also not sort of market researcher, so I don't know those things. But I will say that I think from my personal perspective, I find policies that tend to intervene more on the structural side more helpful, potentially more helpful. The evidence here is really complicated because in a world where we live and where evidence bases are built on sort of the gold standard of randomized controlled trials, it's really hard to generate evidence for policy level interventions because you can't do them until you do them, right? So I think that from a sort of principled standpoint, the structural, more type policy, so I mean things like deciding how close to schools you can build additional takeaway shops, for example, or whether you can, I don't know, licensing laws, stuff like that tends to be a little bit more helpful than things like, okay, we're gonna put some extra information on a package, because that's relying on one person to do the work. Whereas I think if you intervene in the environment, you take that away. Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thank you. That presentation was fascinating. Something that I found really interesting about your approach was that when you talked about academic discourse, you were drawing from a lot of different fields and a lot of different disciplines, and you were trying to find themes from all of them. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about if you found conflict between the things that different disciplines said. Like, do philosophers and ethicists say the same thing as economics, and do they say the same things as behavioral scientists? And
That's a really good question. I'm not going to be able to answer it in full scope right now, but I'll pick my favorite part of that, which is, I think, actually about terminology. So we have, because I did philosophy of science before this, so I've been interested in understanding the differences between words like autonomy, freedom, liberty, all this stuff. The thing to note is that these get just conflated completely across almost all academic disciplines, aside from formal philosophy. So you end up people saying things like about agency and autonomy, and making very different claims that actually mean very different things, and especially choice. It's a very vague word, right? There's a lot of things that can be implied in choice. But they're used just in a completely kind of mishmashed way. So in some ways, the conflicts are internal to like the language that's being used and the terminology itself, rather than necessarily oppositional points of view, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. Okay, last but not least, we have Michael Elizabeth Geisher, who is an MPhil student in Health, Medicine, and Society. She'll be presenting her research on trauma, financial stability, and mental health care access among Arabic-speaking migrants and refugees in the Netherlands. The floor is yours.
Hi, folks. Thank you so much for coming. Even more so, thank you for staying. My name is Michael Elizabeth, and I'd like to start my presentation with what I think is a particularly powerful statistic. And it's that in 2021, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees estimated that about 89.3 million people are forcibly displaced from their homes. That is about 1 in every 100 people on this earth. And within that, since the start of the Syrian civil war in 2011, 6.7 million Syrians have been displaced from their homes. So with that in mind, and with a little image of, actually very large now that I'm standing up here, of Syrian refugees in a UNHCR camp, I'd like to start by talking about my research, which is focusing on a subset of both forced migrants and migrants by choice, specifically in the Netherlands. The Netherlands has a population of about 660,000 Arabic-speaking peoples. That includes nearly 100,000 Syrian refugees who have sought refuge in the Netherlands since 2011. The thing that my research focuses on is the fact that migrants and refugees often have unique physical and mental health needs that other people in the general population may never face. So that includes mental health problems. Migrants, refugees specifically, are more likely than members of the general public to experience post-traumatic stress disorder, among other common mental illnesses. Unfortunately, in addition to these sorts of problems, migrants and refugees also face a number of unique physical, mental, and psychological barriers to care. Financial instability is one of the largest. As a person's sense of financial instability goes up, their likelihood of accessing any form of health care goes down. My project builds off of the COVID-19 mental health survey, also called COMET, that sought to look at how different demographic variables predict mental health symptomatology during the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, this survey was administered in 14 languages in 10 different countries, but it had never been translated into Arabic, and that's where I came in. For my project, we expanded this survey to Arabic speakers in the Netherlands by translating it into Arabic, and we added the additional question, and by we I mean I realized I'm using the royal we, it was just me. What affects this population's access to mental health care when we're looking specifically at Arabic-speaking migrants and refugees in the Netherlands? So, my hypotheses were twofold, and the first one was that number of types of traumatic experiences would predict likelihood of accessing mental health care. More traumatic experiences, less likely to access care. Furthermore, I hypothesized that post-traumatic stress disorder symptom severity would mediate this relationship. And by mediate, I mean it would help explain how traumatic experiences and access to care are related. Furthermore, I also predicted that financial instability would be related to access to mental health care. As a sense of instability increases, the likelihood of accessing care decreases. And I also postulated that adherence to COVID-19 regulations, which in the Netherlands affected many people's ability to work because of lockdowns and curfews, would moderate this relationship. And by moderate, I mean it would affect the strength of the relationship between financial stability and access to care. So with that in mind, I worked with native speakers, who I'm very much indebted to translate the survey, the comment survey from English into Arabic. So this involved a blind back translation. I worked with one native speaker who translated it first from English into Arabic, and then a second speaker who translated it from Arabic back into English, and then worked with that second speaker to make sure that we had the right sort of meanings and connotations from the survey that would be administered to Arabic speakers. The survey was ultimately administered in September and October of 2021, and our inclusion criteria were people over the age of 18 who spoke Arabic and could give written informed consent. We did exclude people who were living outside of the Netherlands, as we were trying to target just Netherlands-based Arabic speakers. Now, on to my results and the descriptive statistics. I ended up with 134 respondents with a 47% to 53% female-to-male split. They were aged 18 to 71, and out of these 134, 43.5% reported feeling distressed. There was a question that just asked point blank, do you feel psychologically distressed? And 43.5% said, yes, I am distressed. But of those people, only 44% of them also said that they were distressed and they were seeking care for it. So there's that discrepancy. Now, I also investigated the relationships between financial stability, number of types of traumatic experiences, and access to care. And neither traumatic experiences nor financial instability predicted someone's likelihood to access care. Both of these relationships also remained insignificant when controlling for time spent in the Netherlands, which I did given that people who have lived in the Netherlands for longer have had more of an opportunity to seek healthcare just on the basis of how long they've lived in the country. Now, my mediation results were not significant. Post-traumatic stress symptoms did not mediate the relationship between traumatic experiences and access to mental health care. Now, you might notice that traumatic experiences did predict post-traumatic stress disorder, which statistically speaking was good to see, because if traumatic experiences did not predict post-traumatic stress, that would be a huge red flag in my research. Again, the moderation results, not significant. It remained insignificant when controlling for time in the Netherlands. Adherence to COVID regulations does not moderate the relationship between financial stability and access to care. Now, with those previous results in mind, let me turn to a different part of my results that I'd like to report today, and that is the major barriers to care reported by my respondents. So the first was, I didn't think treatment would work. I thought it would be inconvenient. I didn't know where to get help, and I thought the problem would get better if I handled it by myself. So with those four in mind, I think it really highlights a sense of distrust in the healthcare systems available, or at least a lack of knowledge of what sort of support systems are in place for Arabic-speaking migrants and refugees in the Netherlands. I think especially that last one, which was the most common one, I thought the problem would get better if I handled it by myself, might also indicate a cultural difference in how these people approach mental health and illness. Now, before I wrap up, I'd like to touch on some limitations and future directions for this kind of research. The first one is I used a convenience sample. As you might imagine, migrants and refugees are generally pretty distrusting of an academic who sends a survey and asks them to share personal, sensitive information about themselves. So I relied on convenience sampling and a snowball method to get as many people to respond to the survey as possible. Speaking of responses, 134 is still a relatively small sample size for a survey, so it is possible that my analyses were underpowered. And I'd also like to highlight a dearth of prior research relevant to this population and especially the Netherlands in particular. I tried to draw off of relevant studies with Syrian refugees or Arabic-speaking migrants or specifically Moroccan populations, although Moroccans don't necessarily speak Arabic, that's another story. But it ended up being very hard to extrapolate from or sort of derive hypotheses from other people's research when different countries have such different approaches to welcoming migrants and refugees and to offering healthcare in its many forms. Now, in terms of future directions, I'd like to highlight, not that I necessarily need to, the fact that there are always going to be migrants and refugees in the world. War is not going out of style, although I wish it was. The war in Ukraine is one significant example, recent example. I've seen research coming out done in collaboration with Ukrainian refugees into this sort of topic. I hope to see more. And I especially hope to see a deeper examination of barriers to care so we can figure out how we can make people feel more comfortable when it comes to accessing systems of care, especially when they themselves are saying that they're distressed. So, in conclusion, I just want to say again that it's very important for us to figure out how we can best support migrants and refugees in the Netherlands, here in the United Kingdom, all over the world, by figuring out what we can do to